And according to any number of sources, the British Code Center here, and I'm trying to remember the name, Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park can read this, and they read it from Hong Kong, from Singapore, and all these other listening posts in the Far East. So, this would tell you that there's going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor. This purple will not tell you, but JN-25 will. The U.S. Navy cannot read JN-25, right? They can read very limited number of things, right? 10% of a given message. Now, you have these two interesting authors, Russ Bridger and Nave. Nave is from the Royal Australian Navy. And their thesis is, Churchill was aware that a task force had sailed from northern Japan, it was headed for Pearl Harbor, and he deliberately withheld the vital information from Roosevelt as a way of getting the U.S. into war at any cost. Roosevelt was deceived by Churchill, who took a gamble that this would bring the U.S. into war with no opposition. It did succeed in that, but it lost the British Empire in the process. Okay, so that, I think, is at least a sketch of Pearl Harbor. There'll be much more to say about this. I'm collapsing a 2-hour Guy Fawkes and a 2-hour Pearl Harbor into this to spare you. Now we're almost, I've gotten special requests from a number of people to talk about Italian terrorism. And I think we have some people here who are authorities in this here tonight. I was over there in Italy in the late 70s. This is 1978. And you have the kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro, who was at that point the former prime minister and a leader of the Christian Democratic Party. Here he is assassinated. Now, Moro's plan was so-called historical compromise. And what he wanted to do is to say, instead of having coalition governments that are constantly shifting with lots of little parties, let's bring the Communist Party into the government with the Christian Democrats to have a big, stable majority so we can carry out needed reforms and progress and have a stronger country. The Communist Party, of course, by this time is not a communist party. It's simply a social democratic party with a labor base and nothing really much communist about it. They were called Comunisti all'acqua di rose. That is, rosewater communists, or pink communists, right? Very diluted. And his partner in this is the head of the Italian Communist Party, Berlinguer. So these two together, and they're also responding to the attack, Kissinger's coup in Chile in the early 70s. They're trying to make sure that doesn't happen in their country. So they want to have a strong national government. These are nationalists, and this is a wonderful thing to be. However, Kissinger, based on pure hysteria, says, no, 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 no. Why is that? He says, well, we have the Yalta line of demarcation. The Yalta line of demarcation says no communist role in the government anywhere west of the line. This is why some terrorism, and 9/11 is an example, can be described as spheres of influence or geopolitical terrorism. This is an example. He's saying, if Italy goes to the communists, we lose the whole Mediterranean, and then Europe is lost. Because that's one way you lose Europe. Is you lose the Mediterranean, it's gone. So the big conflict then that emerges is between Kissinger and Moro. And after my book was published, and after Moro, and of course all the rest of it had calmed down, the widow of Moro came forward and said, a very high-level American threatened my husband and said that if you don't watch out, you will have a very bad end. So I recommend that you stop doing what you're doing, Signor Moro. Signor Moro. Now, I was approached in this the summer of 1978 by a former member of the Italian government. This is what he looks like today. Giuseppe Zamberletti. He had been Deputy Interior Minister for Secret Services. And he said, why don't you write a story, do a longer article about the media and the Moro assassination. And I got a bunch of friends together. We went to Wiesbaden, Germany, spent our summer vacation. We came out with a book, which is the one I showed you before. And again, the thesis is NATO intelligence is behind this. Not the Warsaw Pact, not some communist organization called the Red Brigades, or anything else. And here we are in Milan, the 1st of May, 1978. Sorry about the French, this was my Montreal show a couple of weeks ago. Kissinger and Gardner kidnapped Moro, it says. Kissinger, Gardner, the U.S. ambassador, they kidnapped Moro. This was during the time before he was killed, because he was kept as a prisoner for a couple of months. And of course, we can't forget Licio Gelli, the Grande Maestro of the P2 Lounge, which was Mazzini, under British auspices, that created Propaganda 1. Under U.S. auspices, now they create Propaganda 2. So he's the Grande Maestro of that launch, which is the center for organizing the background and the build-up for this. And I've also been asked to say a couple of words about Gladio. Gladio is simply this. It's a stay-behind organization. In other words, they said, well, what if the Red Army comes and the Soviets take over Italy? We've got to organize guerrilla warfare. So they created a network of guerrilla fighters whose goal would have been terrorism under the Warsaw Pact occupation, and arms and explosives and equipment and thousands of people, and the whole thing was completely secret. And I went through all of this. Gladio did not become known for almost 22, 23 years after this. The P2 Lodge became known about 3 years after this. But in this book, we basically have it all except for the names. Gladio was created by Lyman Lemnitzer, who had done Operation Northwoods on the U.S. side. He then became the NATO commander, and in about the middle of the 1960s, they began creating these deposits of weapons and explosives. Now, we're getting towards the end, so thank you for your valued attention. And you'll be rewarded now with 9/11. Let's just look first of all at the obvious absurdities, contradictions, impossibilities, and related issues of the official version, okay? Because they told me that some people come in and they don't know anything. I figured, again, this would be the most sophisticated audience in the world. I think it probably is here in London. But let's just go through this in case people have just come in off the street. Sorry. So this, of course, is it. Now, what do you call this? The collapse of a building? This is a building exploding. It's being pulverized. It's being destroyed in midair. And you've got debris being thrown out hundreds of yards straight up. It's obviously a very violent process. And remember, in the middle of all this, you have these tremendously strong columns, which are the structure of a suspension bridge, a battleship. They're extremely strong steel. And they're tapered, they're very thick at the bottom, slightly less so at the top. And it's a heat sink. In other words, if you apply tremendous heat to any one point of this structure, the effect of the steel is to convoy that heat away. You have to heat the whole thing up. And you know that you don't, with a kerosene fire based on jet fuel, you don't get anywhere near the temperatures you would need to determine the fall of these buildings. And instead, what we get is this molten metal, right? You can see it. It's metal that has been liquefied by what must be a tremendous heat source. And you can see it again. The molten metal is pouring out of the side of the building. Now, could a kerosene fire do that? Have you ever had a kerosene stove and liquefied a steel pot or a steel pan? Have you ever had a gasoline motor that melted? I think not. But in this case, we're told, and they say, well, that's the aluminum from the airplane, and it turns out not to be. Now, here's one of the typical detritus of 9/11. Now, that's one of the pillars. That's one of those 45 or so columns on the inside of the building. And you look at this. Does that look like that was done by a fire? It looks like it was done by an oxyacetylene blowtorch in the hands of a very skilled craftsman, but it's probably not that. It's the result of controlled demolition. Now, this kind of picture is what Rudy Giuliani didn't want. Rudy Giuliani banned all pictures at the scene, the ground zero. And he then carted off every piece of steel to melt it down so you couldn't get a picture like this, and you couldn't go and analyze what's in this molten metal, because it turns out, of course, to be thermate. It turns out to be this chemical compound which creates a very, very high degree of heat and can indeed produce the temperatures that are needed.